I am so glad to see you. It's been some time, but I am back again with more adventures in Australian literature. Exciting. So before we get started though, on this week's book, I have another book to tell you about, and that is this one, Black Cockie Press's 12-week novel writing masterclass. So if you think you have the great Australian novel in you, this book will help you get it out. So it's available on the Black Cockie Press website, and there are links below. It's available. You can get it anywhere. Get it. It's a great book. Really will help you. The book for this week is That Deadman Dance by Kim Scott. This was published in 2010. It won, it's actually won a whole load of prizes, including the 2011 Miles Franklin Award. Now, if you're from overseas, if you're an overseas viewer, the Miles Franklin is the Australian equivalent of something like the Booker Prize. Okay, so the English Booker Prize, I think somewhat equivalent to the Pulitzer Prize in America. It's, needless to say, in Australia, it is the premier literary prize. You win this, you are set. Patrick White won it a couple of times. It's named for Stella Miles Franklin, who is an early Australian novelist. We will get to her. This won the Miles Franklin in 2011, and it was the second Miles Franklin that Kim Scott won. Okay, so why are we doing this book? Well, not only is this a Miles Franklin winner, Kim Scott is an indigenous man from the Noongar people in Western Australia, which makes this a really, really fascinating book and a really fascinating perspective. So it's a very, very different and a very, very important perspective to have, and a very important voice to have in Australian writing. So what's it about? As usual, I'm not going to give you a synopsis. I want you to read the books. But That Deadman Dance is set in the Swan River settlement, which is the original white settlement of Western Australia. So it's down on the southwestern coast of Western Australia, down near Albury, and it tells the story of the settlement and, more importantly, the encounter with the Noongar people. The story is narrated by Bobby and I'm going to try my hardest to pronounce this properly, but Wallabaginni. So he's a young Noongar man who is quite friendly with the colonists. He's a fictional character, and he has, as you can see, two names. He has Bobby, which is the name that he's been given by the settlers, and he has Wallabaginni. I think that's how you say it. Wallabaginni, which is his indigenous name, his Noongar name. Now, the settlement of Western Australia, this early part of the settlement, is colloquially known as the Friendly Frontier. It wasn't a situation which immediately devolved into violence. That doesn't mean the violence didn't happen. It did happen. It just came a little bit slower than it happened in the East. Mostly because they weren't bringing a truckload of convicts with them and doubling the population of the Sydney Basin overnight and causing mass difficulty with food. You're going to get pretty instant conflict in those situations. Western Australia was a state that was not, or a colony that was not founded on convicts. It was founded by the settlers because there was concerns about foreign powers sniffing around the west coast of the continent, and the British were like, we better put something there in case the Frenchies turn up. So that was why the Swan River settlement was established from a British perspective. It didn't bring truckloads of convicts. Truckloads of convicts didn't turn up, and then in Western Australia there really weren't truckloads of convicts anyway. The transportation only lasted a few years. It was only mail, and it was not terribly large. They used them as a workforce, so you didn't have that happening in Western Australia, which is part of the reputation of the friendly frontier. Kim Scott is very different from most people who are writing about the settlement of Australia, because most people who are writing about the settlement of Australia are white. So this is a very, very fascinating book, because this is not written from a white perspective, but from Black Australia's perspective. And that's really, really important to keep in mind when you read this book, because I read this, I had enormous trouble reading this. I had been reading Australian books for ages, lots and lots of Australian books. I spent 3 years reading Australian books, and I had enormous trouble with this book. And I'm reading it and I'm like, why is this thing so hard to read? It's an Australian novel. It's written in English as its first language. What is its problem? Why am I having a hard time? And then I realised, yes, it's an Australian novel, but it's an Indigenous Australian novel, and I was expecting it to play by the rules of a white Australian novel, and it doesn't. It is a very, stylistically, it is very, very different from what you would expect even a first-person narration to work like. There is very little quoted speech in this book. There are very few female characters, which is something that I did find took a lot to get my head around, why he had so few female characters. And I think it has something to do with the fact that he is speaking from an Indigenous perspective, and therefore that's women's business. Those are women's stories, not men's stories. And so he can't tell those stories because they belong to someone else. Ownership of stories is really important. Also, one of the things that is so fascinating about this is that he sets up a dialogue at the beginning of the book. Bobby is part of that dialogue. Bobby, at one point in the story, says, we took your blankets and your axes and your flour, and we learnt your language and we learnt your songs, and we had no idea what we were giving up when we did that. And we had no idea that as we learnt your language, you had no interest in learning ours and learning our stories and learning our songs. And that exchange that he has set up, that the settlers, although there are sympathetic characters, Dr. Cross is very sympathetic and interested in the Noongar people, when at the outset of the colony, Dr. Cross is also killing them inadvertently because Dr. Cross has TB, which is now spreading into the Noongar people. You actually see when you read Watkin Tench's diaries. He was a Marine in the Marine Corps in Sydney. He kept diaries of the early Sydney settlement. He actually mentions the fact that illness has accelerated ahead of the Europeans. There are Indigenous people who are from what we now call Wollongong area who are getting sick and dying well ahead of any Europeans getting there. So all of this, all the destruction, the contamination is all in this book. But the book itself is, again, attempting what Bobby is lamenting. Here are our stories. Here are our songs. Hear us. See us. And that is something that makes this book unbelievably generous. It is a book about an event or events that will ultimately decimate this people, completely destroy a way of life. And yet here is now Kim Scott saying, let's try again. Here are the stories. Hear us, see us. And that makes it incredibly fascinating, and that makes it incredibly generous. It's not a story of... It's not a story that ignores the 200 plus years of displacement and violence that has happened. But it's an incredibly generous story. It's not saying be guilty. It's saying hear us and see us. It's also very fascinating to read an Indigenous perspective of these things, because although no modern writer would attempt to write a story set in any early settlement and not include Indigenous people, the desire not to speak for, not to appropriate, can become somewhat problematic, in that Indigenous characters can be seen as either silent and mysterious, although present, or at times even infantilized, as we have to guess at the workings of those characters. And so it is a hugely problematic, that representation is hugely problematic in stories. Kate Grenville, in her sequels to The Secret River, did cop a lot of flack because of the way that she portrayed the Indigenous characters. Kim Scott doesn't suffer this problem. Kim Scott is giving us the words that we want, that we need, the words we can't. He is not having to, White Australia isn't having to put these words into someone's mouth. This is Indigenous Australia speaking to White Australia, and that makes this book so fascinating. So, Miles Franklin winner. Actually, it took out a whole slew of awards. I can't remember all of them. I'll list them down below. It took out a huge number of awards. Go check it out, because you won't have ever read anything like this. You really won't. You won't have read anything like this. So, I give you Kim Scott's That Deadman Dance. And that's all for me this week. I will see you again sometime with further adventures in Australian literature. So, bye.
If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books, books and other materials to help with your writing.